I've noticed that when I am in a fasted state, so when I'm in ketosis, when I'm, burning fatty acids and making keto bodies and using them as energy, I'm like on top of my mental game. So I've been doing, like when I have any sort of like podcast interviews I'm doing or whatever, I'm always trying to do them fast. Like I'm fasted right now. And so I thought to myself, like, is this something that could be mimicked by a ketogenic diet? Like, it's very noticeable for me where I can stay focused. I have more endurance. So, like, I don't, like, crap out, like
more
couple hours.
Mental endurance.
Mental endurance, sorry, yeah. More mental endurance. So, so I decided to try it out. And I recently had a neuroscientist on the podcast, Dr. Mark Matston. Have you heard of him?
No.
He's like legendary. I mean, he's probably one of the most cited neuroscientists, but he's most well known for his intermittent fasting studies, like the 5-2 intermittent fasting stuff came out of his lab. He's also sort of the father of hormesis and like why, humans sort of adapted to be in a stressful environment and how, all these stress response pathways that happen, as a response to that are beneficial. But anyways, so he was talking about like when you're in a fasted state, when you haven't eaten, how your nervous system has sort of evolved to become like more focused, more alert. And that's adaptive because if you can't find food, you have to be like alert in order to like eat or else you'll die. So, so he's talking about like one of the main things that happens is this metabolic switch, is what he calls. But so you do switch from burning glucose, as a source of energy to basically, fatty acids are immobilized from your adipose tissue and go to your liver and you start to like oxidize them and use them from energy. And then you make something called ketone bodies as a byproduct, beta hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate. And most people think about these, well, this is an alternative source of energy. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. It, is easily used by, neurons and other cells as well. But it's actually an energetically favorable source of energy. So it actually requires energy to use glucose as energy, to make energy from glucose, requires energy. But beta hydroxybutyrate, that doesn't happen. Like it goes into the mitochondria and it's used without that energy requirement. So you can imagine.
Explain how that works? Like that you use energy to use glucose?
Yeah. So glucose gets broken down into something called pyruvate. And pyruvate, so it takes energy to do that. And then pyruvate has to be transported into the mitochondria through a like active transport mechanism. And that requires energy to do that. Once it gets into the pyruvate gets into the mitochondria, it's then used through what's called the TCA cycle to make energy. So beta hydroxybutyrate gets converted into acetyl-CoA, and beta hydroxybutyrate can just go in without like this active transport mechanism. So you're not requiring that energy to transport it in. Does that make sense? So you're making energy, but you're not using as much energy to make that energy. So that's kind of like what most people are thinking about is this sort of metabolic switch that happens. And you can imagine most people never do that. Like I typically, I do a lot of time restricted eating where I'll eat my food anywhere between 8 to 10 hours. And then I'm fasting anywhere between like 14 to 16 hours a day. And in order to actually go into this metabolic switch, you have to deplete all of your glycogen levels in your liver and muscle. And that usually takes anywhere between 13 to 36 hours, depending on the person's carbohydrate intake, on their physical activity. And so, most people never get that metabolic switch. Most people are just constantly burning using glucose. And then when you're doing that, any fat that you're taking in gets stored as triglycerides in adipose tissue. So they're always in this like fat storage state instead of a fat burning state, right? And so, because most people are eating 3 meals a day and plus snacks, you never get there. So, with the anywhere between 14 to 16 hours, that's what I typically was doing. I'd noticed that like I was really mentally sharp. And so as I extended that out a little bit, it was like really clear to me that like not eating was like good for my brain in terms of like I felt smarter. I felt like I could focus more. Like it was noticeable, like a nootropic effect, right? And so one of the other things that's probably less well known about beta hydroxybutyrate, which is one of the major circulating ketones you do make when you're in ketosis, is that it is actually a signaling molecule. And this was shown by Dr. Eric Verdin. He runs the Buck Institute for Aging in Novato, California. He showed, back when he was at UCSF, that beta hydroxybutyrate activates many different genes, one of them including brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which I know we've talked about before in the podcast. But that's something that is critical for, forming new synapses and for learning and memory. I mean, there's all sorts of things that it does. But beta hydroxybutyrate's activating that. Like, it's not just something that's being used as energy. Like, it's changing gene expression. So that got me really interested. It's like, wow, this is something that could be possibly also activating BDNF. Maybe that's partly why. I mean, it's a hypothesis, but it seems like something that people could test, and it seems kind of, it makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. And so that was something that I was like, wow, what if I could do? So I asked Dr. Mattson, I was like, there's lots of, differences between being in a fasted induced ketosis and a ketogenic diet. But there's also a lot of similarities. And the similarities are, one, you're making lots of beta hydroxybutyrate. If you do the ketogenic diet right, we can talk about that. But, and so I was like, wow, well, maybe. And then the other thing that overlaps between the two is that you produce a lot of GABA. GABA is the neurotransmitter that's typically more of an inhibitory type of neurotransmitter. I'm sure Dr. Dom D'Agostino has talked about this. I think I even remember him talking about it before, that GABA is increased on both, ketogenic diet and when you're in a fasting-induced ketosis. And GABA is, it kind of has an anxiolytic effect, so helps calm you a little bit, but also seems to affect, and this is what, some researchers think the reason why a ketogenic diet is so beneficial for drug-resistant epilepsy is through GABA, because it quiets down the neurons that have been excited through glutamate. So right now, we're having an intellectual discussion, and we're intellectually engaged, and so glutamate's being fired, right? And it can do a lot of damage. Glutamate, having this constant electrical activity, very stimulating. You need something, if you didn't have GABA, you'd fry your brain, without it, with too much glutamate. So it can cause something called excitotoxicity. And so GABA kind of counters that. And so anyways,